you're telling stories from the margin, but also you're centering them through visuality again. You have a history of how comics, graphic novels, illustrated books were written by teachers, scholars, historians to really maintain this continuity of readership from the younger generation to the older generation. For me, this project, it's part of a way I think about memory and history. One way to understand the work of any historian is also we can understand it through the prism of their own biographies. You take these stories of people that we think that they are people without history, and then when you start digging deep, you find that these people were connectors of a global history.
Welcome to Radio Ifriqiya. Today we are talking about The Last Rekkas, Professor Aomar Boum's latest book, which attempts to present an indigenous counter-visuality to the work of colonial artist-ethnographers. My name is Amin Bet, and today I am joined by the Professor Aomar Boum. Dr. Boum is a member of the Suffolk editorial team and the holder of the Maurice Amado Endowed Chair in Sephardic Studies at the Anthropology Department of the University of California, Los Angeles. His work as a sociocultural anthropologist with a historical bent has focused on the social and cultural representation of and political discourse about religious and ethnic minorities in the Middle East and North Africa. His most recent work, The Last Rekkas, is a collaboration with his daughter, Majdouline Boum Mendoza, that retells the stories of his father while also combining them with the visual works of his daughter. Dr. Boum, thank you for joining us. For starters, I wanted to ask you what pushed you to write this book? What was the impetus behind it?
First of all, thank you, Amin, for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this personal, historical, as well as ethnographic project. So this is a project that I think began. I've never thought that I would write it in the way it is written now, but the work for this project really began in the middle of the 1990s. When I was doing an ethnographic study on folk dance, and which is a popular or an Amazigh folk dance in the southern part of Morocco, in the village of Tissine, which is not far from where I grew up. And looking or doing oral history for this project, I started to talk to my father about the social dynamics, tribal dynamics, local history, given the fact that we don't have a lot of writings about that part, with the exception of some of the writings that was left by Mokhtar Soussi, which I'll get to later, and some French ethnographers / military personnel who wrote about this region. So in those conversations, my father started talking to me about his history. Mind you, I'm already 1995. I'm already 25 years old, and I've never had that really deep, thoughtful conversation with him about his life history. Given the fact that we rarely, and most of the older generations in Morocco at the time, we rarely actually engage with them about their history, about their biographies, and so on and so forth, especially ordinary people. Remember, this is somebody who was illiterate, never went to school, never left the village, with the exception of certain moments where he went back and forth, at least at that time, to my knowledge. And once I started talking to him about the region, he started talking to me about the Rekkas, this profession, quote unquote, that he was forced to do. It was not something that he would pay for. And from there, I finished my MA, and I went on with my life. And then I start every summer when I go back to Morocco, or whenever I have an occasion to talk to him, I started digging slowly about other things, about farming, about water management, about moving from the village, about his relationship, what he knows about neighboring tribes and neighboring villages. And that's the collection of this was, I was really thinking about writing a biography, an anthropological slash biographical account of his life. And he passed away. I had my daughter grew. My daughter was born in around 2010. We started going back to the village every summer from Arizona and then LA to Southern Morocco. And then she had this special relationship with him. She had always, at the age of 4, she was interested in drawing. And I could see she's drawing these sketches of the family, of my mother, of him. And then when one of my brothers passed away, I wrote an essay about him and she did all of the drawings. My father passed away 2023, November 2nd, 2023. And then this idea came to do an essay about him in the same way we did an essay about my brother. And as I started writing it, basically in 2 months, instead of writing 2 pages or 3 pages, it ended up 50 pages. She started doing the drawings. And she was actually the one who pushed me to do that. And then I gave her the text, she read it, and then said, I'm going to do a drawing of every section. And that's how this project was born. It was born, it was, and it was not something that I planned for it. It was just probably because of his karma. Basically because of his barakah. It's something that emerges from literally a personal response to the loss, to the death of my father and to the death of a grandfather of my daughter.
That is incredibly moving. Thank you for sharing that, Professor. My next question was going to be, how do you think about the inclusion of your daughter Majdouline's art in the book? What effect were you hoping to create? It sounds like we will, yes, for sure, definitely get to speaking about Mokhtar Soussi and the kind of theoretical foundation behind this project. But it also sounds like the inclusion of your daughter's art was this incredibly personal gesture, beyond just a kind of, beyond basically the theoretical foundation. Could you speak more about it?
This is a great question. I've always, when we think about ourselves as professors and teaching in universities and doing research and engaging in research, I think for me, that's an important part of what we do. But I really believe in engaging with not only our kids, but also engaging with K through 12. So for me, yes, I had a special relationship with my daughter growing up since she was 4 months because of some family reasons I don't have to get into here. But that relationship really connected me to her in a really interesting way. And that relationship strengthened because of the normal father-daughter or father-son relationship. As she grew up, as she becomes 11 years old, 12 years old, the kids started to do their own thing. So it's a selfish part of me where I wanted, instead of her going and talking to her peers and girlfriends or part of her peers, I wanted to bring her in my world where I want to do things with her that really, on both, in some way, it's important for her, but also it's important for me. But because of her relationship with her grandfather, it was easy for me. So I wanted to maintain that connection, and I maintain it in some way through her skills, which is as somebody who's good really at doing art, and we're doing other projects that I can talk about later. And while she is doing what interests her also with her friends in school, with her mother, and so on and so forth. So I'm using, basically, she has an artistic interest, and that artistic interest for me, as a father trying to find ways to connect with my daughter, but also to help or have a conversation with her, which is a constant conversation. I'm doing it around through by connection with her and talking to her and having working with her on project that of interest toward us, and then that's where I'm strengthening that bond of a father and daughter.
Absolutely. I've also found in looking at your previous work, though, that visual art and using a visual component in your works has been a very important part of, well, your work over the past 5 to 10 years or so. Specifically, the graphic novel Undesirables
Mm.
comes to mind. So I definitely think that there's definitely a certain personal resonance in using your own daughter's drawings. I also would love to hear more about what makes, I mean, beyond the personal element, this particular book's usage of the visual different. How does it differ as well as build on your previous utilization of visual storytelling? For example, and maybe this you could even take this as an opportunity to speak more about the evolution of this project from Undesirables, if that's a correct line to draw.
That I totally agree with you. I think that's a great uh, question, and it's relevant to this continuity to some extent from the Undesirables to the Last Rekkas. So the Undesirables was a project that I did with my friend Najib Berber, one of the best, I would say, Algerian artists and comic artists that North Africa has seen, I would say. So it's part of the second generation of Algerian artists. We worked on this project of looking at writing a history of Vichy labor camps in North Africa instead through visuals. And so we were part of this conversation about how art helps us understand history, especially World War history, and how we can um, expose it or at least make it available to a larger audience. So, and that answers the partly your question: why this shift to this multimodal dimensions of doing ethnography and writing? So for me, and I think this, I'm not the only one. I think there is a generation of anthropologists and historians that are doing this now, and I'm part of this new movement. But I do see it personally. I do see it as a way to adjust to shifting readership. In what way? In the sense that writing traditional ethnographies in the way we've done them in the past, I think the readership is limited, it's small, and I think there is more people now read news, they connect with the world in many ways through images. And the shift we have the shift because of the phone, because of the iPhone, and all of these things, I think makes us or force us in some way to make sure that I'm not saying that we should rethink the way we theorize things, but I think we need to think about a way of how to theorize images and visuals as to be part of the way we write history and ethnography. And that's the way that's how the Undesirables was conceived. That's why I'm following this tradition. I'll continue to follow this tradition while still maintain some project that or still not. I would still maintain what I've been doing in the past. So this I would say that the way I think about visuals, I think about visuals in a also in a much complex way, in the sense that I'm not interested only in writing or using comics and visuals and images to illustrate text, but I'm also using them to center marginal stories. And that's why I think about this as what I call inside the margins. Inside the margins, it's not only you're not only drawing stories within the the frames that the comics or the illustrated books allows you to do, but you're also inserting stories that very few people are aware of, like the Last Rekkas, like the Undesirables, and so on and so forth. And those stories are helping us understand global and regional histories. So in a sense, what we're doing, we're decentering the center and making the margin a new center and helping us expand how we see these narratives. And that's I think, these stories, and I'll if conversations allow us, I'll mention some other stories that I'm working on right now that really we're still doing global history, but global history from the perspectives of the people who have always been marginalized. But their story was central to, for instance, the last Faraji's story was central to how we think about the Glawa, the Lord of the Atlas, how we think about the colonialism in southern Morocco, how we think about the Senegalese tirailleurs in southern Morocco, how we think about a lot of things, how we think about farming, how we think about desert, how we think about oases, and how we think about droughts and palm trees and so on and so forth.
This is really, really fascinating. I have a separate kind of question later on about how you make this argument about the Saharan space existing au lieu de a kind of typical archive as a way of creating archives in southeastern Morocco. But that is, I will ask that question later. I really wanted to ask. Actually, instead, we spent a lot of time talking about images and also how the introduction of images creates a certain decentering of the margin that's incredibly productive and a very rich site for changing the way in which we receive information. So I wanted to ask, actually, 1 year ago, in speaking about this novel, you did an interview, and The Last Rekkas was described as a novel. My question is this. Is it? Is it a novel? Is it a biography? Is it a history? Does it fit into any kind of neat genre or categorization?
I think I would call it an illustrated story.
Mm.
And it's definitely, there is some novel in terms of the way the script, because this is a script that's written that has a plot in some way. And in that sense, there is a biography, there is a narrative, there is some elements of that highlight this increase of this, what we call the apex of the story and how it goes down, and all these drama and dramaturgies notions. I'm somebody, I had a training in direction and script writing in drama and art going back to but that also helps. And then I also have some background in cinema and working also with this with Walt Disney, and so all of these things that definitely helped me not create it's still facts. All of the data that you see in both the Undesirable and the Last Rekkas are really factual, all based on archives. But you have to give it that touch of, because you want also to, I get back to the reader. I'm also interested in K through 12 and the general public. So there is that. But I'm also, the difference between me and other people who have written about this region, and I hear reference Mokhtar Soussi is writing about the region, is that Mokhtar Soussi, in the way he describes in Arabic these communities in the Sousse region, in southeastern Morocco, in Akka, in not a lot in my village, the detail, the way he uses words is as if you're looking at an image. I don't have that skill that Mokhtar Soussi has, even though he's one of my, I really believe that I see Mokhtar Soussi as one of my mentors. I'm using the image, I'm using the text in some way, but the image of my daughter, the drawings of my daughter helps actually make this even clearer. And that's where I think all these elements of the novel that you mentioned here, to some extent exist. And And they exist because they're also a response, and I can talk about that if we have time. They can respond also to similar strategies that were used by French colonial travelers and ethnographers when they wrote their travelogues. They have the text and they have the image too, not the drawings. Some of them do have the drawings, and we'll come talk. But they have this combination of the drawing and the image that if you go back from the 1800s to always to 1920s in this, when we talk about Morocco, for example, and you can expand that to Algeria, to Tunisia, to the rest of Africa, the African colonies, you can see that the image is already a model, a tool that's used by the French colonial ethnographer to enhance what kind of messaging they want to transmit to their readers. And what I'm trying to do is to follow a similar approach, but decentering the image and the text and putting it in the hands and centering the story of Faraji and the people who are actually put in as a footnote. Mm-hmm. Why? Because all of this history, for instance, from the 1920s to the 1930s and 1940s, Faraji was part of this colonial presence in southern Morocco through forced labor, being a Rekkas, and we haven't defined what a Rekkas means. But we'll get back to that. Mm-hmm. But his story, in some way, is really a story that has always been bracketed off from the main narrative. So what I'm trying to do is create a similar text, engage with the colonial ethnography, because I don't think we should eliminate it. That's a personal view. I think we have to engage with it while writing this text that from the voice and the narratives based on the biographies and the narratives of the people that, quote unquote, were seen as people without history.
Absolutely. Okay, we're juggling a couple of ideas here, but I want to sit with this for a second, and then maybe also we could sit down and define a little bit of the historical context with regards to the Makhzen decree of the creation of the Rekkas as an attempt to combat French and German posts. But I thought your comment on Mokhtar Soussi was fascinating because you're absolutely right. When you read him in Arabic, he has this certain kind of meditation that he does in any encounter, right? There is a certain amount of just description and time and effort spent with regards to description that I think when you read, in particular Western writers, there's this kind of glazing over that takes place in those same encounters that I think is so fascinating. So, no, I think in this case, maybe, yes, we could spend a little bit of time just talking about the stakes of these kinds of this kind of approach to doing ethnography, maybe talking a bit more about Mokhtar Soussi's approach, maybe talking a bit more about what the project of colonial ethnographers were, maybe talking about French and German posts as opposed to the Makhzen Rekkas. Maybe I would like to just hear a couple of your responses to some of these questions.
So that's a really an important point, an important question that we have to engage with, and we have to keep in mind while we are writing post-colonial histories and post-colonial. I think those texts were so full of really important ethnographic details that I think, for instance, here about Charles de Foucault's Reconnaissance au Maroc, which was written in 1880s. It got this really important, this celebration in Paris by Société de Géographie de Paris. It became an important text that allowed, in many ways, the French government and the French colonial government to prepare for the colonial entry and the colonization of Morocco. It's a text that still, if you take that text now and you go to villages that Charles de Foucault described, you will be surprised that the amount, at least in terms of the topography, the sketches and all of these things, they really reflect the reality. And then you put that in the context of conversations that I had with my father, I would say 80% of what my father was telling me in terms of life, social life, connection between the tribes, the relationship between tribes and the tribal lords, and so on and so forth, was really almost similar. Now, there is an ideological background, of course, an ideological basis for this. Then that's where this is where you start seeing the differences between the views of my father, for instance, and the views of Charles de Foucault. Now, if you fast forward from 1880s to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, when Mokhtar Soussi began to record these histories, you see really similarities in some way in terms of the details, the ethnographic detail. Here you have a historian who was trained at Al-Qarawiyyin, whose job was to record the histories of the region, and as he calls it, min afwahi rijal, from the mouth of man. Mm-hmm. That's a purely ethnographic capture of the realities of these communities. And not only that, but he gives you a detail about social makeup, social stratification, all of these really intricate details. And what I liked about him too, and this is where Mokhtar Soussi becomes central to the project of the Last Rekkas. Mm-hmm. If you look at Min Afwah al-Rijal, for instance, which is written in 3 volumes, I would, if my memory doesn't fail me, in Min Afwah al-Rijal, in one of the volumes, in one of the introductions, Mokhtar Soussi says the reason why local indigenous anthropologists and historians have to write about their own families. So he's pushing for. So Mokhtar Soussi did write about his family in many ways, especially his grandfather and his father, but also he's pushing local anthropologists and historians, in his sense, historians, to write about their histories. And he's saying that one way to understand the work, the general work of any historian, is also we can understand it through the prism of their own biographies. And that's why he's encouraging anthropologists and encouraging historians to have a space in their writings at some point in this longitudinal spectrum of their writing, to have a space for their own families. And by doing that, they're also informing the reader about the general context of what they're writing about and how they are perceiving and how they're thinking about issues in general. So, and that's for me, between the mode of writing and what we write about, these two things are important as far as, especially at this stage of my career, to inform the readers. They have who have the right to know about where I'm coming from, mm-hmm. in my right. Why, for instance, minorities feature a lot in my work. Why I'm writing mostly about the margin. Why for me, most of my work really always go back to Southern Morocco, and always go back to oasis communities, to oasis societies. There is a personal element there that for me is central, even before we start thinking about these small groups or small minorities, whether in Lebanon or whether in Tunisia, Morocco, and the rest of the Middle East and North Africa.
Absolutely. Really, really important insights. Yes, I definitely, I have so much to say. A lot of what you said really resonated, but I wanted to kind of center around this idea of, likewise. I mean, you brought up Mokhtar Soussi, and I specifically, I think of the quote that you use in a presentation of yours. He writes, "If historians are credited with an undeniable but modest merit for documenting people who are not related to them, why should we not document our own families in all its facets?" Yes. Paraphrasing. But I likewise wanted to, bring us back to the visual a little bit, because you also in the same presentation talk about how important this work is, creating this kind of not just counter-ethnography, but counter-visuality. You
Yes.
mentioned this. You described this encounter where you in this market in Morocco, you found this
Yeah.
pillowcase
Yeah.
that had an image of a Moroccan that was taken by a colonial ethnographer, and it's kind of used as a jumping off point for talking about the counter-visuality that's presented in this book, a way of pushing against the influence of colonial artist ethnographers whose images have since become a part of the way in which Moroccans maybe represent themselves or understand themselves. And so, yeah, I'd like to speak a little bit more about that. About, I mean, I hate to use this quote because I feel like
Mhm.
it always kind of harkens back on.
Mhm.
It kind of harkens back to. It's very often used, I think, in these kinds of in these kinds of contexts. But the very famous quote from the Brumaire that goes, "They cannot represent themselves; they must be
Yeah.
represented." Yeah, I mean, just kind of pushing against this sentiment. But would love to hear your thoughts on this.
No, that's really that's a very good point. I think let me start with my daughter. What my daughter
Yeah.
said. So I remember when I gave her the text, she I was very. It was a very thoughtful point that she brought. She said, "Do you have?" She said, "Yes, you gave me the text. I've seen the village. We don't have a lot of images of my grandfather, which is true. I actually don't have a lot of images of myself too until we start getting to Marrakesh and until I started my BA in Marrakesh in the 1990s. But
Hmm.
if you look at my album, between at least in the early 1970s, 1920s, the camera didn't exist in there. But that's probably then I became really a big fan of photography and camera. So
Hmm.
my daughter asked me this question because you don't have a lot of pictures of her. I want if you can get me a corpus of images from the region or from the time where my grandfather lived. And then, so I had to go through Gallica, I had to go through Nantes, all this really this different archives of images that when we have a lot of them, and then that would lead me to something that I the historical um, archive of images that were used as a in a way to counter the colonial image.
Hmm.
So my daughter said, "Well," I said, "Why do you need them, man?" I knew that she wants to use them as to use them as a way to uh, create her own images that correspond to the text that we drafted, the ethnographic text. And she said, because since those are images that were created about or taken to represent that time, there is a way to rethink them. There is a way to re to shift the zoom in a way where they still capture a space, but that space I can fill it in my own way through the voice and the eyes of my grandfather. And so basically it's a shift. It doesn't say that you're denying, you're erasing the reality that in some way was captured by a colonial photographer, because it's there, but we are changing the spectrum. We're adding another voice, another layering. We're layering the voices here, and then we're layering the shot here with the image that's taken. So that's where I start. And then I started looking at the corpus of images that were taken in the 1930s, early 1930s, when my father began, actually mostly when he was really active, 1930s, 1940s. Began in his late 20s. He does talk about in 1929, 1928, about the first time he had to deliver letters to neighboring villages. But really, most of his activities, is talk about the 1930s. And this is where I was surprised to find in the interviews that I've done, and I literally didn't pay even attention to them, when he started talking about Jean Besancenot. So who
Mm.
is Jean Besancenot? Jean Besancenot I was probably one of the most important photographers, ethnographers, ethnologists, painters, artists that Southern Morocco knew, because of the way he captured a huge repertoire of images of costumes and jewelry all over southern Morocco. He was brought in the 1930s, 1934 exactly, around 34, by Georges Spillman, who was, this is a French military man who basically was involved in the colonization of a region south of Marrakesh, began with Ouarzazate, making it a military post, and then he brought him to provide a record of all these tribal laws, quote unquote, tribal costumes, quote unquote, and which later on were presented in Paris to President Lebrun. And then he ended up writing a book called Costume au Maroc, which was autographed by Sultan Sidi Mohammed bin Yusuf in 1942. Mm. What's interesting about these images is that my father, in one of the trips of Jean Besancenot to the region of Fumsgate, where I grew up, and Mohammed and Tissin, my father accompanied him.
Wow.
But here you have Georges Spillman, you have the key figure that he wrote actually 2 books about. You have Georges Spillman, you have Jean Besancenot, you have the tribal Glawi, all of these. This man saw Faraji, my father saw a lot of things there, just like other people, other Rekkas or other ordinary. They were at the center, but their voice, what they've seen in terms of representation of the history of is not recorded. So, in a sense, what I'm trying to do here is to engage with these images, which in many ways they're capturing, they're staged. Many of them are staged, of course, and that's as he was taught. And then, so taking these images, at least in the way they represent the context, the oases, the rivers, the mountains of Beni, the mountains of the Anti-Atlas, all of these elements, they're now taken by Majdouline Boum Mendoza and interpreted in her way, but arguing that she is using the voice and the vision of Faraji to tell the story of what he saw. That's the way. That's the only way I saw it. Now, in this sense, I am not also what Majdouline is doing, and this is where most of her work, most of her contribution to the book comes from. She is not in some way calling for the erasure or the bracket in half or the elimination of the work of Jacques Majorel, who did who took a lot of images in villages, in areas that my father had to deliver letters to, like the village of Anmeter, the valley of Unila, which was under the control of the Glawa family, like Maurice Tranchant de Lunel, or Jean Hainaut, or Jean Théophile Jean Delay, all of these key figures, artists who actually captured this region through their paintings, through their sketches, through their piece of art they left, which is now presented in some cases in the Louvre and in other museums in France and Europe and even in Morocco. All of these really interesting production, artistic production, is in some way what Majdouline is doing. He's saying at the same time these artists are producing this knowledge, whether through art or paintings or photography, Faraji was also in living and delivering letters to the people that these artists were engaging with. And that's where I think art in some way becomes, that's why art becomes central. Majdouline's art becomes central to the ethnography here, or to this, what I call here, an illustrated history, to add another layer to what all these French artists have produced about this area in southern Morocco where my father worked as a raqqas.
So important. Really fantastic comments. So I keep thinking, and I mean, this is probably just because I've worked on him so much, but I mean, the Moroccan decolonial theorist Abdul al-Khatibi would point this out as an example of decolonial thinking that he would point this out as an example of the fact that decolonial thinking must not be compensatory in the way in which it engages with Western thought and academic scholarship. And so I ask,
Yeah.
in a kind of very straightforward way, would you say that there is a part of this project that is foundationally decolonial?
It is.
Mhm,
I think it's a project that does not. But the way I see this decolonial reading and thinking,
mhm.
it's an addition to what has been erased. So
Yes.
yes, if you are the colonial contributions or the colonial engagement with these indigenous and local communities,
Mhm,
left things that are harmful, things that are positive, quote unquote, all of these things. So what I'm doing here, I'm really trying to
mhm,
tell a different story from the perspective of Faraji, who saw the who basically, in some way, was affected by this colonial history.
mhm.
He was affected in a way by doing things through force. This is a forced labor.
Yes.
He was not paid for it. He was sometimes asked to deliver a letter in a day, come back, and the next time he has to go back to. So there is no. There is no the question of dignity, the question of human respect, and all of these things. Well, the way he talks about them, of course, in his own way, he still thinks about the question of what we call forgiveness.
Mhm,
He's always said, I'm I am alive. But and then at the end, for me, the fact that the project, this book, was presented at La Mairie de Paris in
mhm,
2004 in this big hall where Faraji's voice and Majdouline and I and Driss Yazami sitting around and talking about the book, is La Mairie de Paris,
mhm.
was a huge win for Faraji.
Of
His
course.
voice, his voice is somebody as somebody who was given so much at a time where information, where the only way to communicate is to have people move, walk, not ride horses or mules or donkeys, but walk. Walk for
Mhm,
days. He's been doing that for over 20 years, or he did that for over 20 years. And then to come back and nobody, he goes, the French, the colonial presence ends, post national history starts. And the only way to where his voice, there is some form of justice there. That's
mhm.
for me and for probably he didn't live to see that. He passed away after. But at least for me and for Maggie, my daughter, and for me as a historian, it's it's a it's there is some form, as I said, of justice that his voice is finally heard,
Mm.
and the text is heard in French, in and English, to some extent in Arabic, at La Mairie de Paris.
That is so profound. I can only imagine what it must have felt like to feel that kind of quiet solace in recognizing that his voice was being heard. I guess I had just a few more questions before we're out of time. But
Yes.
on that kind of note, you didn't in an interview you did for the book, you described its audience as for all of the coming generations of Moroccans. Could you speak more about who you hope this book is received by? And the kind of message or goal that you have for it moving forward.
So for me, this project is for it's part of the way I think about memory and history.
Mhm,
So it's a generational memory. It's the story of a grandfather telling his story to his son, and his son is working with his daughter in a way to translate it in different ways to different audiences. So it's a story of memory and generation. That's part of how I think about many things, especially when it comes to transmission of memory and how do you deal with crisis of transmission. And in some way, it's also telling something that very few people need. We don't engage in Morocco with our colonial, pre-colonial history. So for me, when you think about this, the story of the Rekkas, the Rekkas as that's something that was part of administrative histories in Morocco, going back to the Makhzan story, going back to Moulay Slimane, and even before Moulay Slimane. This has always been there. And of course, it's never organized. And then you have Moulay al-Hassan around 1892 comes and tries to reorganize it because he's trying to push against what we call independent post was emerging in Morocco in 1890s, and also responding to the German, to the French, to the Spanish, and to the British presence of male presence in 1860s, especially in Tangier, as a response, and seeing it as the beginning of a colonial presence. So here you have communication is central. Of course, the way we move information and the way information moves around is central. So whether it's slow, and he's really trying, Moulay Hassan al-Awwal is already trying to speed up and then organize the Rekkas. The story that I'm telling in Southern Morocco is different because it's a place where the presence of administration, like for instance between Fez and Tangier, or Fez and Rabat, is not or even going all the way to Marrakesh, is different from the way all these tribal villages in the anti-Atlas worked. So I want from this project, when I talk about the future, I want to communicate, I want to talk to a different audience outside of the walls of the university. Yes, it's important for me as a researcher, as a historian, anthropologist, to write this and to think about this in the context of the university, like UCLA, for instance, or other universities in Morocco. But I also wanted to be part of a conversation with the K through 12, to go back to the model that comics played in the Arab world, in Sudan, for instance, in the 1940s, in Lebanon, going back, starting from the 1950s and 60s. You had a history of how comics, graphic novels, illustrated books were written by teachers, scholars, historians to really maintain this continuity of readership from the younger generation to the older generation and to the generation of the universities in some sense. So that is really what I'm interested in here.
Absolutely. No, it feels like a really kind of strong through line through our conversation has been recognizing that, well, these members of our families whose stories haven't been told, they also deserve to be heard. And so they're just such a wealth of information and history that just has been marginalized, has been sidelined, has been bracketed off. Absolutely. And so I know that we are running out of time, but I also kind of wanted to broaden the scope of the project a little bit as well, because I know we didn't get a chance to talk about the archive as well, just in general. But you also spoke about how space and cemeteries exist as an archive of the Sahara. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, in the region where I grew up, we do have an archive. It's an archive that comes from independent judges. It's an archive that's related mostly to manuscripts, Islamic manuscripts. Sometimes it's related to land tenure, water sale, mortgage, and so on and so on. Rahano, all of these different texts that really are about land tenure and watershed. And in that sense, because you're dealing with an oral history, generally, I'm not saying that there is no writing. There is a writing uh, of these histories, but it's not to the extent that we wanted, especially when we talk about marginal groups like the Haratin, for instance. These are Haratins are a group of black, mostly people who worked the land, and my father was one of them. My father was not only a Rakkas or a male person who delivered letters from one region to another or village to another, but also in some ways he was also engaged in farming. He was very good at dealing with palm trees. You can see an image behind me here of me of him. He was one of the last. He was one of the last people who actually were able to, who can actually handle any palm tree you can have in the oasis in terms of harvesting, in terms of taking care of basically of most of the palm trees of many people, at least in his family and his extended family, and the people who actually asked him to, especially migrants in Europe or in Casablanca and other cities. So in while I'm so one of the things I've been thinking about is how to expand the how we engage with people and how we tell stories by looking at materiality, what people hold, and that's and then how to at some point encourage them to tell their stories by using objects that exist in the village or exist in their household or exist in their rooms to encourage them to tell this. Because I faced that with my father. One of the ways that actually triggered all this conversation with my dad was his bag, his bag of azarakas, the bag that he used delivering letters. And there is a lot of histories that are untold of people who went through slavery or people who were engaged or were part of the whole tribal histories that the only way for me is to in some way ask them, or at least is to begin questions by talking about these spaces. In cemeteries, they're going back to the cemeteries. One of the ways, for instance, I found very interesting in the way we talk about taboo topics, or sometimes even historical moments in the history of these communities, like, for instance, why in the 1970s and 80s you have a lot of kids dying because of the lack of vaccination. There are these sections. There are these sections in a way in cemeteries, for instance, where whole sections of just cemeteries and tombs of kids, and then they go over decades, for instance. And so that's, for me, I was able to tell those stories of these families and what these women struggled with just by asking people, starting there. And that space led me to tell stories of families and what they struggled with, how they treated the sick, why they didn't have access to vaccination, all of these things. So, and it's a moment when now we talk about the histories of uh, World Health Organization. We talk about all these debates in the United States, for instance, and the rest of the world about whether should people vaccination or not. All of these things. If you talk to ordinary, they have their reflection on this from a different perspective. They're thinking about it from a different perspective. And I've seen it in my own family. I have sisters who lost 5, 6 kids in the 60s and 70s. I have brothers who lost kids too. I know a lot of families. So that's, for me, it's between talking about a jar where dates were stored that was owned by a tribal lord, and those jars held or stored dates. Those dates were harvested through forced labor or by slaves. All of these elements, in some way, encourage us to use materiality and material object to reflect on bigger questions, taboo questions, historical events, and so on and so forth.
This is so important. Yes, I've found also, I mean, your stories now and your accounts now remind me so much about experiences in my own life. I remember one time that, I mean, space, in fact, does tell stories in my own life. I went one time to the southeast of Morocco, and I was with my mom, and we were just like going to the village where my grandma was from. And one time there was like this group of houses in the distance, and I asked my mom, I was like, oh, who lives there, right? And then my mom was like, oh yeah, there was like at one point, there was like this American family that like moved in there and they lived here for 10 years and then one day they just disappeared. And I'm like, what? It's like I'd never heard this story before. And yet that just like that vision, that space, that object in the distance, that house itself contains just so much information that you need that kind of, you need somebody to make that push to say, okay, what's this object's story? What's this place's story?
And I think that's a great point. I mean, I think, for instance, I remember I wrote this piece for journal Tamazgha
Mhm,
about this villa where Journal Agdel was started
mhm,
in the 1930s. And when I went, it took me a lot of time, first of all,
mhm,
to convince people to get in. Finally, I had a really hard time. Finally, I was able to trace this house, who owned it, and people were looking and said, "This is weird. What is this? Is scary." But it centers that space where things start is important to how you understand that.
mhm,
I'm doing now a project on fashion and how fashion um, migrate, the involvement of Moroccan Jews in the fashion industry, going back to 14 or even before 14, 15th century. And so looking at how basically objects move around and which spaces they get to be formed and so on and so forth is really important in understanding bigger the abstract point that we're trying to
mhm,
deconstruct and understand. And that's for me why you cannot understand the Haratin, whether in Mauritania or Morocco, without going through farming, without going through the question of water management, without going through other things without going through objects that are related to this, because that's the only way they can relate and they can tell their histories. And that's what I found in talking to my father,
mhm,
that he can relate, he can tell histories, he can go, you can talk to him about Tamskirt, for instance. Tamskirt, this equipment that you use to cut leaves.
mhm.
It's an Amazigh word, that to cut leaves from palm trees. And he just through Tamskirt, you can get a whole story about different types of dates, what
Right.
kind of palm trees you have. And and that's how you engage. That's how you have conversations, because you want to have a conversation. And the only way you can have a conversation, you got to start with what's familiar to the individual you want to talk to.
Absolutely. I have just one last question for you today, Professor, which is I definitely want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about what you're currently working on and what listeners can maybe expect from you in the future.
I'm working on many projects about
Mhm,
in the same in the same category of the Last Rekkas.
mhm,
And these projects are part of this concept that I call inside the margins. And inside the margins, which is telling, it's the margin, it's you're telling stories from the margin, which is exactly stories that I already mentioned here in the, but also you're centering them through visuality again and multimodal. So one, I we I'm working on with my daughter and I. We just finished one. I'm working now on a text of a story of a Moroccan who in the city of Marrakesh who is restoring riads.
mm,
So and he's restoring riads in these old houses throughout the city in the traditional way by using traditional material and also trying to make them as part of the city of Marrakesh as a living city. And this is a story that goes back to 1970s, 1980s, even at the time where people were moving outside. I'm also writing a story of a transatlantic story, which we just finished, that connects Guinea Conakry to Morocco, to Mauritania, to Mali, to the United States, and to Liberia.
Fascinating.
And so that story, it's a story that I'm working with. It's part of a story of a not people slave or looking at working with the community even in Guinea. Will give me the rights to tell the story. So it's a transatlantic story. Again, it's about, you can see here, it's the question and the concept of memory and transmission and history is still central here. And I'm looking also at the story with these are the two stories I've done with my daughter. I'm working on another story with other artists, Moroccan artists, mostly teenagers. You can see here that there is a part of the project that I'm thinking about is to think with and work with the youth.
Yes.
It's very important. And I not only think about with youth, but also, so I'm doing one project with my colleague Sarah Stein, working with artists about rendering or our work which looks at ostrich feather trade. Here you have another global dimension, but working with artists again to have this artistic but also textual element. I'm also working with another undergraduate students, American students, on a similar topic here in California. So all of these, for me, this approach of how you take the stories, you do the research, the archival research, and in-depth archival research in all kinds of languages. You write the script, and you use the multimodal dimension. You can use graphics, you can use images, you can use a combination of a photography, a photograph, and at the same time a sketch, and so on and so forth. All of these things are really part of how I'm trying to think about what I learned as a quote unquote professional historical anthropologist to expand and to broaden the conversation with new players or new partners in the dissemination of knowledge about Southern Morocco, about Africa in general, and how that knowledge also can have connections to this part of the world and to Europe. So again, what I'm saying is that you take these stories of people that we probably wouldn't even we think that they are people without history.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you start digging deep, you find that these people were connectors of a global history and of global histories. And that's hopefully what I want people to take out from this new venture that I am engaged in.
Absolutely. Such a remarkable sense of plurality undergirding all of these projects. Super interesting. But Professor Boum, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. And would just like to say thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me. Thank you.